Okay, I've been discussing my model with some people, which has given me some experience with, I guess, how to fill out certain explanations about it. But I'm actually so excited because this is finally coming together in a crystallized way. There's structure that has come together, which is impossible for it to be a coincidence. And so I feel like I'm on very solid ground, not just because of how it comes together, but because when I look at the model, it is an explanation and a description of my internal cognition, which is uncanny. It's so precise, it's so detailed, and I have also been interacting with other people who I believe have the exact same metagram type as me, or at the very least the same meta type as me. And being able to observe that externally as well just confirms um, a, it helps me ground a lot of my things because without a comparison, um, it wasn't because when you're just dealing with one case, if you're just dealing with essentially an anecdote with yourself, you don't know what is. It's hard to dissociate if certain behavior or certain characteristics are being generated from which part of the model, because these are two models that I'm integrating, and so without like a comparison, it can be hard to just distinguish like what is generating what. So again, some of this is slightly speculative, but I think I'm on very solid ground, and any change from what I'm about to go into is going to is going to be I mean, it might be profound, but it's going to be it's going to be within what's already, it's going to be very compatible, very close to what it is that I'm describing. I mean, it might be a shift, but it's going to be like, uh, it's not going to unsettle the other um, features that I'm going to be describing. It's just going to be a kind of a slight sort of reinterpretation of a phenomena, which, I mean, I guess, it will amount to a different description, but uh, it won't break anything. Anyway, okay, so I can. So I mean, this doesn't mean much until I can actually publish everyone's type in some sense. Until I can make it readable or accessible that people can see all the different types there are. So essentially, in my system, there are 17 MBTI types, but and I am going to sort of describe maybe some of the. I'm going to give overarching descriptions, I guess. I can now create narratives or a kind of an overview of what's going on. And so I can make general comments. So I'm going to be making a lot of general comments that describe the system and describe what's actually going on in psychology. Um, and again, like I might be wrong, but I'm very close to the truth. So like obviously that I have uh, obviously the details that I say might be wrong, but there's going to be something that is functionally similar to it to take its place if it is technically wrong. But this is a rough outline which is pretty gold because this is frankly it is so corroborated by so many things that to have actually now an explanation that is actually essentially so close to a true narrative in essence, or it's functionally so descriptive, it's functionally so is is a breakthrough in psychology. This is a complete revolution in psychology. It really is. Um, I guess there are some questions which are close to the beginning, which are still mysterious, um, which will have to kind of be felt out as the kind of perhaps when more minds look at these structures and maybe regress in terms of retracing their own, because this is very enlightening in the sense that um, and you'll see this from the general comments that I make, it should bring light to people. It should illuminate to them what it is that they've gone through in their psychological journey, as it were, in their psychological development. So, I mean, I have a lot to say about psychological development. I have a lot of commentary that will contextualize and that will outline and frame people's what it is to have their personality style. That what the internal entanglements and structures and what's going on inside their schema. So never before has there been such a nuanced and delicate description, functional description of what's going on in terms of I mean, you could call it perhaps a bit of a computational structure, but anyway, let me just get into it then. Okay, so yeah, I guess, so you do have to take what I say with a pinch of salt, because there might be a functional upgrade of what I'm basically trying to describe. And obviously, as the whole description gets more, let's say, practiced in its explanation, and will sort of eventually come perhaps with some discoveries about some other types as well, refining the insight as to how these things actually hang together perfectly. But we have to start somewhere. Okay, so I have two systems. I've got metatype and metagram. And in some sense, okay, so metatype is produced from philosophy. It starts with a deep theory of mind, and it has a metaphysic, which essentially classifies cognition. So it classifies cognitive operations or cognitive objects or whatever within a kind of hierarchy. So metatype, in some sense, is a theory of cognitive functions. Metatype has 17 cognitive functions, which then I have rebranded as the 8 Jungian cognitive functions, and I just have slightly more precise definitions of those 8 cognitive functions. But whenever I display any of those cognitive functions in metatype, I also give a number, because then that specifies exactly which version of that cognitive function it is, because actually there are 17, not 8. And so I've got definitions for the 8 cognitive functions, which are somewhat, sort of homogenized, more broad definitions or technical definitions. And I've got 17 specific definitions. And those 17 specific definitions are a bit tough to get into, because the system of meta type, the core deep theory of mind, or whatever, the philosophical foundation of it, is itself a very powerful, deep sort of thing. It's very interconnected. Each cognitive function is supported by another cognitive function. So in some sense, there is, on some level, there's always a huge amount of familial parity anywhere you look on the 17 cognitive functions. The function before it and the function after it is going to be closely connected to it, because they are sequitur. It is a sequence that the one flows into the other, flows into the other. And so there is this kind of graduation that keeps this kind of sequitur flow. And this is why we see this is why MBTI has been able to be successful, even though it's an approximation, is because there is this natural sort of numerology in some sense in terms of cognition. And so, and type is structurally similar. Everyone's type in metatype in some sense. Okay, and I have to make a slight qualification to that, because now that I've married metagram and metatype, I can start to outline why there are subtypes within metagram that have a metatype. I do have an explanation for that, but anyway, but generally I was dealing with metatype. So basically, I developed metagram to discover and to prove metatype in some sense. So let me just say that metatype is pure theory, and then metagram is taking bits of that theory and metagram was made from empiricism. Metagram was made by observation. It was made by looking at people, looking and looking at them from the outside. And so it kind of comes from a theory. It comes from a theoretical extraction from metatype, um, and which now I can only give the full story of that now that I've been able to integrate them more closely. So this is wonderful. Um, and I'm not going to try to do it now in an overview. That will be when I'm making general comments about the structure of metatype, which now essentially has metagram built into it, or I have a cogent thesis that integrates them, and I have uncanny findings about verifying that essentially. And so essentially, all my claims, or look, I'm going to go into the structures of the mind. I'm going to narrate, I think, how they develop and how it should be conceptualized, because it is complicated. It's very complicated. It's very elaborate, and it just seems very, very complex. And when you're describing something that is so complex, you just think, well, how can this be? You're just saying this or whatever. But I mean, in some sense, this will only ever be verified by psychometry. This will only ever be verified by people, but by teaching people. In some sense, I'm saying, this is a story about what psychology looks like. This is a story about phenomenology. Here is perhaps your type. Look at it and say that, see if you can match it up or something like that. Now, there are some ancillary issues to this, which is that I think that on the typology side, I can win people over in terms of raw evidence, in terms of psychometry. I think that there will be I will be able to generate a bank of proof, as it were. The problems that I have is if people want to take this from the pure theoretical standpoint, from the metatype standpoint. Because if you take this from the metatype standpoint, you have to agree with me on philosophy. You have to agree with me on metaphysics in some sense, or you have to, I mean, well, maybe you don't have to agree with me, but you have to agree with some of the sort of implications that metatype implies. And so I often end up making the same kinds of broad philosophical arguments, but they're usually those arguments only arise from talking about cognitive functions. And I mean, usually this is because I'm really talking to people that understand something about cognitive functions. They define the cognitive functions to mean something in a certain way, which in some sense to me already makes them a spiritual person. They already, I mean, many people have commented sort of off the cuff that people that believe in MBTI basically belong to a cult, or that it becomes their religion or something like that. And I mean, I'm not saying that people that believe in that there's something to MBTI also don't also have a religion or something like that. But in terms of my understanding of what a religion should be, I believe that that's roughly correct. That that there is a truth in the mind. There is a truth to a metaphysical sort of I mean, the set of cognitive functions is a way of describing and perhaps defining parts of thinking, of cognition. And as soon as you define elements of consciousness, and you say that they are canonically held by the set of definitions, you are trying to gain an understanding of what should govern and have authority over immaterial operations of the mind, essentially. And so you're already in a kind of esoteric domain. You're already in a kind of immaterial philosophy, or which I think perhaps opens the door to transcendentalism, unless you're going to have a particular unhealthy cult towards one of the cognitive functions, which is usually why I will debunk introverted thinking. And I have general philosophies as to why introverted thinking is not a way to ground a worldview, is essentially will always be misleading, because it must always be contextualized. Anyway, I'm not. I'm already sort of half introducing into that rant that I have in my back pocket, but anyway, I've got those in my other recordings. I talk about the cult of TI, um, and how TI is always premised in supposition, and that TI is not the judgment of what is correct and what is incorrect. It is only the judgment of what is self-consistent. And the only way that you can get away with thinking that self-consistency pertains to something about truth or an absolute or something like that is that if you believe that there's a kind of TI unimatrix that's behind everything, and you're just sort of assuming that if you can claim that something is a true valid piece of the TI puzzle, that then it's undeniable, rather than it's only valid within a particular perspective or a particular um, you still have to substantiate an independent realm or paradigm that makes it pertinent, that makes the utilization of TI. So in some sense, I believe that TI has a, I mean, if you want to believe that TI is somewhat stable by itself or static or canonical, then you have to kind of just blindly uh, um, assume that somehow TI becomes the prima materia of reality, or which is essentially what scientism sort of does in its very embarrassing non-philosophy, even though um, people don't really track very cogently, for example, just how badly science is at philosophy and how it has even undermined any of its supposed philosophical claims, that perhaps empiricism or something like that. They forget the hidden premises that underpin science. For instance, I mean, science is completely predicate. I mean, the original scientific language was much more honest and humble, because they didn't say this is a scientific law. I mean, some schools did, but generally, I would say the more intelligent scientific thinkers would just use much more precise and correct language, which they would say, we're uncovering regularities. That's all we're doing. We're discovering the regularities of nature, or the regularities that can be observed. So you're not making a claim about the law of nature. You're not making a claim about an underpinning law of reality. It's just you've discovered a regularity. You're investigating regularities. And so, when you talk about regularities, you keep in mind that you're presuming that just because something happened in history, it happened in the past, uh, and it's repeatable in the future. Therefore, the past mirrors a theory about predictability that you can replicate. That essentially, that you're not assuming that the future is the same as the past. That just because something is predictable uh, uh, doesn't mean that it's true. It just means that it's something that seems to be a regularity in reality. So it seems to be a regular feature. You see, I said see. It apparently seems to be a regular feature. The only way that you can say that, well, its predictability is anything about its veracity, is if you believe that determinism rules. I mean, you first have to presume the law of determinism, that the past is the same as the future. You just have to just blindly accept that presupposition to say that you're talking about a law of nature. And I mean, it's not, I mean, when I say that science has undermined itself, it's because when, in the 1920s, when we finally got better pictures of what's going on in quantum mechanics, then we realized that determinism isn't the operative principle of how reality even works. We know for a fact that reality runs on probabilism and not determinism. And so to kind of keep that blind faith in determinism alive, we just moved into a statistical model of reality. So we said, well, the kind of TI that is the unimatrix underneath, that undergirds reality, is now not a static determinism or a mechanical determinism. It's a statistical um, formula or something like that, uh, which is, I mean, there's a paradox in that, but I don't want to harp on this too much. I mean, I can sort of exemplify that, which is that I mean, this is not a direct example. This is indirect exemplification. But I mean, you can see that this is unsatisfactory. Then there's a problem with this, because then essentially you can just say, well, if your statistical data does not conform to that formula, well, that's because your sample size is bad. So you just disagree with reality when it doesn't match up to the mathematical model, which is supposed to be this law that you are uncovering. So you see that the whole thing, in terms of the model has degraded itself. I mean, the model has rejected its own validity in some sense, in terms of its philosophical cogency. But that is just by, that's just forgotten conveniently. Um, uh, that somehow scientific truth then somehow then insulates itself, that it's so misshapen within its own inept philosophy, can not even stand any scrutiny from any other intellectual camp other than science. Only science can disagree with science, because of it's so philosophically inept and toxic, as it were, and it's lost track of its own intellectual project. But and so I mean, it's sort of, I would just see this as the manifestation of another sort of TI cult. But anyway, there are broader implications to that, because this happens in other fields, in sociological matters, in cultural matters. Is this same kind of invidious, pernicious toxicity? But anyway, yeah. So there are argument, and I mean, I have something that I call a kind of inverted ontological argument, or which is almost like the ontological argument, but from the other side. And I mean, and I need practice at articulating this, and explaining it better. But it goes something like this: Can you, and in some sense, this has to be conducted as a dialogue, because it doesn't really work as a lecture. Well, I mean, I'm going to be trying to lecture it right now, but because essentially it's the proof that that certain thought experiments, certain hypothetical ways of thinking, are void operations. They cannot be. They have an indefinite fidelity, which spoils them and which makes them nonsense, essentially, which means that you cannot use them to extract any kind of reasonableness, or you can't get any reasonable extraction or work done from them. They tell you nothing, because they're just a waste of time, and they lead to a kind of insoluble argumentation. And so, like, so in some sense, I'm trying to kind of show the reductio ad absurdum by asking a question which I consider to be something like the inverse of the ontological argument for God, in some sense, but it has nothing to do with God. So this is, and I probably need some help to reformulate the grammar of these statements to get my point across. But anyway, so it's something like. So it's a question, and basically the point of this question is that it has to be answered in the negative, or it leads to a discussion in which you're supposed to understand that this question can only be answered in the negative, and which is that, can you imagine a hypothetical world in which there is an object that you do not understand? Now, there can be some controversy over the phrase "do not." It can, and I can make it easier on myself and say "cannot understand." And so there are already two cans in this. So the question starts: can you imagine a hypothetical thought experiment or realm or something like that? Can you put yourself in a narrative in your mind, a fictitious world? Can you put yourself in a fictitious world in which it includes an object that you do not understand or that you cannot understand? I mean, okay, so let me make it easier on myself and say, okay, that you cannot understand it. So you have to imagine coming across an object that you cannot understand, not that you happen to do not understand, but that you cannot understand. And if you do that, I think that if you say that you can do that, then you're talking nonsense. Then by definition, because you see, if you come across something that you cannot understand, then how do you know that that thing that you cannot understand undermines the understanding of your ability to have a thought experiment? How do you know that that doesn't sort of fundamentally contradict you? Because essentially, the kind of impossibility that I think is entailed by such a question is that it is not possible to postulate an object about which you cannot have an understanding. You cannot postulate an object which is fundamentally an eternal misunderstanding. That's probably a more... Maybe I should have just started with sort of that. Actually, that might be actually the point at which I actually just want to run with that. Anyway, so you can see how rough this is, but I know this sounds so sort of esoteric and erudite perhaps, and sort of much to do about nothing, but this is just basically to say that, your understanding is indistinguishable from God in some sense. What you understand is what you serve. You stand underneath it. You are as strong, or you are as structured as your understanding as well. But to start to venture into realms, into things in which you have already said that, well, there's some kind of external authority that stands in for understanding, then you have displaced the very thing that allows you to see and know, and because you've blunted your own understanding, you've blinded your own understanding, or you have contracted it. Essentially, you've contracted it to a force that you don't understand. So if you contract your understanding by a force that is supreme to your understanding, then you have just made yourself insane. You've made yourself pathological in some sense. You've made yourself ill or sick in a metaphysical sense, in that you have been imprinted on by something that you cannot understand. And if you allow yourself to be imprinted on by something that you cannot understand, then, I mean, it seems to me that you've given away a piece of your sentience. You have denigrated some part of your soul, essentially. And to some extent or another, I think that is basically the form in which the theme of the false ego complex sort of takes place. It has to do a bit with that theme. And then I would get slightly more phenomenological by sort of taking that theme that I've just tried to discuss, I guess, and to take that to the concept of time, because I think that time in some sense is usually what people give over this power to, that determinism or fatalism or something like that is their false god in some sense, because it's something that they don't understand, but they feel subject to it. And then I usually have a bit of a phenomenological talk about how you mustn't think about the past and the future as being generated by the same thing, that you can believe either in the past or in the future, but you can't believe in both simultaneously in some sense, or you can't believe that you are relating to both simultaneously, because then you are stuck in the world. You become part of this general conditioning, you become part of this collective environment, you become camouflaged like the serpent. You become adopted by the world in some sense, and you are just inheriting things from history that give you your identity and that give you your trajectory, and so you objectify yourself. You from a disembodied, abstracted God's eye point of view, and you're actually looking at yourself from the outside in a narrative, and you've disconnected yourself from that subjective participatory engagement in the living process, as it were. And so, okay, I'm sort of being slightly poetical, but I mean, I can get into the phenomenology more precisely, which is that, so you can have two viable perspectives from my from where I'm looking metaphysically, is and this is all to save free will, by the way. So you can have two perspectives that keep free will intact, which is that you can either see yourself as inheriting resources from your history, and this is all a fiction anyway. You don't have access to the past, you have access to the present. So the present, you can see the present as showing you a narrative about your past or about the resources accessible to you. So you're treating the past as a resource via your participation in the present. And so by your participation in the present, you are unfolding the past. You can recontextualize the past. You can change the narrative. So you get a kind of holistic responsibility for the past as a totality in some sense. And so there might be some things in the past that you don't have an easy command over, but you can then see yourself as having to mount the responsibility to maneuver around it, to tackle it, to to not confront it in a head-on attack, but to do so according to a plan, in terms of how you organize and coordinate your energy in relating to the past via the present, because this is all a factitious sort of overlay, because you're not actually dealing with the past. The past is gone. It's done already. But in a way of speaking, now the reason why I said that argument before I got into this point is because then you get these kind of what I call almost slave moralities. And I think Jung even, I mean, I must be a little bit careful because I haven't read everything Jung said about the collective unconscious, but I do think the collective unconscious has these negative implications, just as many people have false religions in some sense. That the problem with the collective unconscious is that it forces a generalization. It forces a meta-narrative that disconnects you from your participation in the process. And it says basically that, well, look, you inherited things that you're not conscious of. You have artifacts that you sit with that are historical residue, and perhaps everyone's forgotten. Everyone that's part of the living has forgotten about why we sit with those things. So we're collectively unconscious about them. And so all there is in life is to investigate the collective unconsciousness. That's the only thing that is like that we're in a thematic way that we are. That's the terra incognito. That's where we have to discover and to travel, and to make inroads. And people can similarly have can in a similar fashion have a narrative about how we all have our perspective on truth. We all have a fragment of the truth, and we're collecting these fragments, or we're collecting these shards. These are all problematic narratives because they are disconnected from the actual subjective process of participating, in which you're not accumulating something. You're not because you can't see it from beyond your own perspective. So you're adopting a paradigm that is alien, which is fundamentally alien, and which only makes sense from a kind of God's eye point of view, which is quite ironically also what the atheists do with their TI cults or whatever, with scientism or the laws of nature. It's essentially taking the God concept and just putting a insulating sort of barrier to keep it pristine and to make sure that humans can only ever argue about getting closer to it, but that argument is fundamentally, essentially insoluble, and that there are consolation sort of prizes of creating a kind of a sympathetic collective slave morality that we can all share because we all feel overshadowed by the same concept of the insurmountable, or something like that, that we all are in the shadow of the same hard limit, that we all respect the same structural limit that we are imprisoned by. So it's a form of sort of sympathetic or shared captivity and commensuration in some sense. Anyway, and they call this logical because all you can say about that is that it's trying to be self-consistent, but it's not rational. And it also, it cannot be understood. It's essentially it's a sentiment at the end of the day, based on a lot of presupposition, and then they just kind of blithely excuse themselves. Well, everything else is a worse. They just straw man every alternative, and essentially they've stopped looking for alternatives properly, and they say, well, you have to solve my problems and overcome my skepticism before I will go looking for any alternative schema. So it's a weird kind of self-satisfied commiseration, and this is generally why atheists are shunned in sort of esoteric circles, as it were, as just being spiritually immature. And I would say that there is probably a psychological parallel to that as well. But anyway, I will talk about types of immaturity. Sorry, let me just find my thread again. So I was talking about the phenomenology of unfolding the past. So you have to be careful, that you have to realize that when you are framing it like that you're unfolding the past, you're recontextualizing the past, that you don't try to make that its own paradigm, or make that the kind of the canonical paradigm. It's not the canonical paradigm. That's an overlay. It's a disembodied, sort of cosmology in some sense. And the only way that you can do that is by objectifying the soul. And you can only objectify the soul by essentially negating the force of the spirit, which is the actual individual inclination, of purpose, of actualizing purpose. And so, my definition of spirit is just where are you going towards? What are you heading at? Like it's like the compass direction. It's purpose by its very definition is not defined by the destination. It's defined by the immaterial account, the understanding of why you should go towards that destination. So it's not, the purpose is not the actual outcome. It's the positive substantiation and account that would be given subjectively as to why the destination is valued, and how the structure of that value is which will either be convincing or it won't be convincing. And essentially the thing that grounds whether something is convincing or not is not an external authority. You could call it an internal resonance. So at the end of the day, I don't think you can get out of a kind of intuition, or which is effectively what I consider to be introverted intuition. At least one of the forms is what faith is. And then what's slightly higher than faith or intuition is that you have to have mental objects. You have to retain mental identities, mental objects, which you have to choose to track and to evaluate and to use as your metric or your standard, which are the furnishings inside your contemplative paradigm. So, you actually have to consciously sustain the objects that are essentially the whole mind is made up of essentially a form of TI. And so if your TI, I would say one of the most important one of the most important features of that kind of TI is that, and that is more precisely exactly what a spirit is that it's that contemplative system of TI, and it has to be capable of killing itself and reincarnating itself in some sense. It has to be able to slay its own spirit and to be reborn. Your TI contemplative system needs to be capable of self-sacrifice, and it needs to be capable of taking on a new name, of reinventing itself from the ground up. And with that kind of humility, it's able to be a quickening spirit. It's able to participate. And so, in some sense, you can, so if you just want to see this as a thing of accumulating fragments, that fragments of truth, that's a fictitious overlay. In some sense, I can sympathize with it, but it's not going to be what it looks like as a participant, as a subjective participant. That's not what it's going to look like. It's going to look like you gain a fragment, and then you're giving up a fragment, and then you're gaining a new fragment. Maybe that fragment is growing a bit, and then it loses its luster because it can't do something else, and so you have to break it down. And then you have to build a model out of the old fragments. You have to repurpose some parts of it. You have to be willing to be quite radical in some sense. And in terms of that moldability of that TI, there is no consistent pattern. There's no consistent style. This is why the spirit in the scriptures is called the quickening spirit, because it's just always getting because that's all you can say that it's doing, is that it's becoming more proficient at whatever it is that it's doing, but you can't really define what it's doing because it is definition. It is the collection of definitional metrics that it's tracking, which you could say are like the axiomatic underpinnings that fuel your epistemic responsibilism. And the only reason why those values have any merit is because they gain their merit from your agentic when I say that they gain their merit, they gain their epistemological merit from the fact that your agency is taking that to be responsibility, is according the endorsement of your agency is what makes is what gives epistemic weight to those so this is basically, this is not utilitarianism at all, but it is in some sense, well, you're using them, so you're responsible for what you use. And if you were using a different, so it doesn't matter if you change your set later, you can't disown the fact that you were using them. And you must have some, I would say that it's important to develop a sense of independence from your environment. If you just say, well, actually, now I've just changed my definitional subset or whatever, so actually I've changed my name, my understanding has changed its self-identification. So treat me like a new person because I self-identify differently, or something like that. Um, is I mean, that's a fundamentally toxic way of operating, because you're essentially saying that your agency um, is something that can be gainsaid. So it has no conservation between its. Because I would say that the one thing that underpins that TI thing is that even though you are reborn, you are reborn. There's no you if you just want to say that you are the subset and you're not a sequence of experience of whatever subset is furnishing it. Okay, I realize how esoteric some of this sounds, and it probably could be explained a bit differently, but I don't think it's impossible to follow my thesis here. But okay, so now I have literally just talked about psychology models, and then I have talked about introducing psychology models, and then I just gave a very strange philosophical presentation about sort of three strange issues. But I'm probably going to stop this recording soon and get on to the actual structure. But the reason why I like to talk about this before I talk about the psychology, and it probably won't come up, but if I was lecturing this, I would eventually get some pushback over some, or I wouldn't get pushback, but I would get questions about how I'm using the cognitive functions, or how these things fit together, or how I can make the certain claims that I'm making. And I would come up against certain opposition that would come from a kind of a different metaphysical worldview. And although me giving those arguments don't specifically deal with opposing worldviews perfectly, they are a good primer. They are worth mentioning, because then when I'm defending against other worldviews, there's a broader context to my opposition. It will generally fall into the treatments that I've just given. Um, and I mean, I've anyway, I know that that's not everyone's cup of tea, and but and in fact, it would these are issues that wouldn't actually crop up when I'm going over the model, but they would crop up when I'm going over metatype directly, like the pure 17 cognitive functions. If I was going into that, I would get a lot of confusion about, how can that be TI? How can that TI move on to that other cognitive function? How, like what does this dimension of psychological reality, which you call one of the 17 cognitive functions, how can it operate like that? So you're saying that it operates in your mind. It's a kind of phenomenological categorization of a cognitive object. Like, well, what are these objects? There's such a thing as objective reality. How does, but you're saying that your phenomenology supersedes objective reality. You're an anti-realist. I mean, I am an anti-realist. I believe that the spiritual reality is, because we can only understand the world through our psychology. So we must first understand psychology, and psychology is the lens through which we receive all other philosophy. So, um, if we don't have an epistemic responsibilism, or some kind of epistemology which can be rooted in a deep theory of mind, we've already given up actually understanding anything. Because if we don't first understand, uh, the I mean, the famous saying at the Oracle of Delphi, know yourself and you'll know the gods in the universe. but yeah, I think that, just to tie this up in a bow, I mean, we have been misled in intellectual circles gravely, because essentially we have misunderstood that psychology is the queen of the sciences, and without its prominent role in organizing philosophy, philosophy will always be fractured. That the epistemology of philosophy is the ontology of psychology, and if we don't recognize this, uh, it's insoluble. I mean, it's literally a waste of time. I don't know what you're doing, but you're just chasing your own tail, um, and you're trying to, and this breed of psychologists, they're not even worth criticizing. They're such a waste of time. You know, so eager to lick the boots of the neuroscientists to give them some kind of computational model of how consciousness operates. I mean, it's pathetic. I mean, you need to have a theoretical basis for psychology for it to at all resemble some kind of intellectualism. But I mean, the academy is just so rotten, it is so intellectually hollow, that any kind of pseudo intellectualism will, as long as it fits into this blind faith, religious, false religious worldview of some kind of I mean, I've vaguely described it already as a TI cult, but essentially, um, these people have no intuition, and they only can conduct their pseudo intellectualism by effectively um, scapegoating intuition to some extent and creating such toxic, uh, self referential, sort of tautological. It's not even worth criticizing them. They are that lowly, lowbrow, sort of irrational pedants. At the end of the day, uh, so much so that you can't even make any intellectual ground by criticizing them. Uh, it's such a waste of time. They don't have positive structures. I mean, it's like an echo chamber of, you know, it's such a intellectual destitution in some sense that is so agitated and prickled towards being defensive and to, playing these games of using skepticism, um, to entrench their own conjecture at the end of the day, and to kind of to fortify their own presumptuous presuppositions, which they don't even, which they don't even openly talk about. They don't even openly admit to them. It's like their dirty little secret. It's just. I mean, these are really the people that are responsible for why we live in such a decadent and failing civilization. Um, I mean, I guess, if you want to complain, I guess you have to complain about the institutional integrity. At the end of the day, you can't just sort of give a list of names and just say, these people should lose their jobs because they are just sort of poisonous vipers. But anyway, one must work in spite of, or one must still seek to make progress in spite of uh, being surrounded by such mediocrity. But anyway, okay, so yeah, in my next recording, I will just talk about the structures. Just to finish off some of my philosophizing before moving on, and I mean, I realize how slightly embarrassing this is, sort of overlaying this sort of esoteric Christian doctrine. But what I was talking about in terms of the TI, so I mean, and I mean, I do have sort of independent academic writings, not authored by me, that talk about or flesh out these concepts in a more segregated sense of just focusing on substantively um, laying out how these systems would work in other kind of philosophical narrative senses. But in the psychological sense, essentially, I think that if that TI paradigm that has its subset of furnishings or whatever, that as a set, as long as that space, that domain is be it full or be it empty or be it after transition of some kind of reconstitution or recycling, it has a persistence in that it exercises epistemic responsibilism. Then essentially whatever its contents are, uh, it reaffirms the independent agency and the free choice. So in some sense, the actions of that TI will kind of invigorate and have, let's say, positive consequences for other faculties, like the use of reason itself then sort of reaches out into a new vista, is extended into a broader sense of actualized I was just trying to think of a word, but you get a more integrated synthesis between these cognitive functions, which are acting as one in some sense, but in this sense, they only act as one in the record, in with reference to this form of TI, which I don't know if I explicitly said, but is essentially the word. That is what the word is that TI domain. Anyway, and I'm making reference to a part of the Trinity. Okay, anyway, this is to do with the 17 model, and that is actually nothing to do with what I'm going to be getting into, but that's just part of the kind of the as I already explained before, this stuff becomes usually a necessary discussion or dialogue to move through, because the the 17 model of is a philosophical is a philosophically closed, complete system, and you have to make something like that in order to track what is happening in the mind. You have to have a philosopher's stone. And the sad thing is that if you have that philosopher's stone, it still takes you 27 years to empirically trace how that benchmark is being, or that metric is being contorted. I mean, well, that's how long it's taken me, and now I've finally reached a point of integration between empirical observation of cognition, uh, reverse engineering what I'm seeing in terms of the 17 model, essentially. Okay, so let me. Okay, so I this is not a great place to. I mean, I think this is always going to be a bit of an uneasy way to broach these very deep and all-encompassing sort of subjects. But anyway, so I'm just going to start making general comments and start to describe the structure of the development of psychology, which in some sense it would be more proper to focus on the 17 model first. That ideally the first thing would be is to and I really don't have good practice explaining the 17 model, because it is it is an ideal, it's like it's very close the closest thing to it that has ever existed before is Jung's alchemy, when he had his table of tetralogies. The 17 model is actually roughly, it has similar concepts. It is similarly constructed, but Jung just used the divided line. He just used uh, he just kind of took Platonism and he ran with it. I did I was aware that there was something to play the basic Platonic universe between the realm of well, in the allegory, the upper and the lower world, uh, or the realm of the intelligible and the kind of, I can't remember the term, but I guess the material world. So you get, and you kind of have to break up both into. I'm not going to. I mean, I could regurgitate the whole sort of divided line spiel. I don't want to do that, but essentially, instead, I found a much more complicated starting material, although I still use those analogies. So I have a Platonic interpretation of the 17 model, which throws away 5 of the cognitive functions from the 17 model. And in some sense, that is also what was required in order to, this is complicated, but essentially, when I was trying to essentially start from an empirical model and build an empirical model and then marry it to metatype, uh, the simplification was essentially to reduce the 17 model into 12 functions, and those 12 functions are chosen and organized according to essentially how Jung organized his table of tetralogies. Um, so there's a direct parallel between Jung's table of tetralogies and my uh, theory of emotional tones. Um, and I don't want to talk about. I'd rather not talk about the underlying structure of this. I'd rather just have it come out after I make the general comments as to just sort of narrating it as fact. So I mean, this is slightly embarrassing for me because I'm just sort of asserting. I'm just going to be asserting things. So and then I'll talk about how I see them. I'll make comments about how they fit together. So that'll be probably easier to follow. Okay, so um, now in some sense, it's very hard to work out where to start talking about this, because there are two explanations, and so emphasis is going to shift. So let me just say that there is something like the false prophet, and it is what I've described in other recordings, that it is like a fictitious entity that you kind of fall into a dialogue with, and it's kind of like and in some sense I think tulpas, which Jung talked about as well, which I now am going to reclassify tulpa as a species of idolatry. I think generally there are 3 species of idolatry, and I don't think it's possible to have a false ego complex and to not be prone to some form of idolatry. I think the fallen state of the personality, um, of the personality structure, um, is prone to one of 3 species of idolatry. I think I want to comment about this later, but And this also has to do with the type. I mean, this is also closely related to the subject of arrested development or immaturity, and I'm going to talk about three separate species of immaturity which aren't connected to those idolatries. Anyway, so those will be interesting topics later. But so essentially, what happens is that there are two ways of looking at the false ego complex. There's a way of looking. Okay, so I mean, there's almost like a fundamental confusion about talking about where the false ego complex begins, because the false prophet, the first false prophet, the prime false prophet, or whatever, which I linked to the superego. So that my concept of the superego is outside of the false ego complex, but it's a precondition and it exists with it, but it exists underneath it, and it is essentially like it's like a negative of that you can use to make a picture. So the superego is the negative of the positive structure which gets developed. And uh, the negative does have a command built in itself to kind of to surrender to the positive structure. So there is an impetus in that negative superego to start building out of it. It exists to be responded to or to be reacted to in some sense. And in some sense, all the positive structure that develops, and let me just name those parts. So, in some ontological sense, or I mean, I'm contradicting some words that I used before. I used to say like, so I've perhaps confused using the words ontology and epistemology, but in some sense, um, at the real beginning of the process, um, there is an inner dialogue between two entities, and that is like the distinction between the negative superego and the positive structure which leads on from it. And the first positive structure I call the subconscious, and then the second positive structure is the unconscious, and then the third positive structure is the ego, or the adult ego, or something like that. Now, the thing is that the subconscious implies the unconscious, and the unconscious implies the ego. Although most of the ego, oh my word, I don't know how to describe this. Most of the ego is surreal. Most of the ego is almost like a kind of 2/3 of the ego is not within the false ego complex. So 2/3 of the ego is not present within the false ego complex. And when I say that it's not in it, it means that it's trying to do something that it doesn't have a script that it can follow. So it has to kind of do a best fit. It has to kind of repurpose parts of the subconscious and the unconscious to do that function in the ego. That is if the ego does develop. Because in some sense, right at the start, you're just a subconscious. Your first positive structure will just be the subconscious. So in some sense, the subconscious is the most real aspect in the false ego complex, and it's also a positive. It's the most real positive thing. I mean, in some sense, the superego is just as real as the subconscious, but the superego is by itself, and the subconscious has at the beginning it's a naive connection, but it has at least recourse to the facilities of the other sides of the mind, although it has to kind of gain confidence in moving into it. But how it actually accesses the other sides of the mind, because right from the start it needs to, in some sense, access all the other sides of the mind. Okay, I was just interrupted, so I'm not exactly sure where I was. Talking about the sides of the mind, talking about the superego, and so all the positive structures are sort of happening simultaneously, but at the beginning they're only happening naively, and the sub, yeah. And so in some sense, what is being developed from a young age in a child or whatever is that, and this is the general sort of commentary, this is the general narrative of what's actually happening, is that the superego is like the environmental unconsciousness in some sense, or the environmental shadow rather, and as a negative expression is being explored by the positive structure, which is the positive image of that negative shadow. And the more responsibility that is grown for the superego, essentially the superego is being developed into responsibility taken for the positive structure. And so whatever positive structure is not the person that has the personality style, whatever responsibility they are not taking for the superego is being projected onto the environment as the collective conditioning, as the metaphysic, as the fatalism, as the determinism. So essentially, the superego will supplement for whatever positive structure is not being um, attributed to positive agency or an internal locus of control. So you can look at people's positive sides of the mind, and in some sense they will be enacting them, but the account for why they are enacting them will be a combination of I chose this and a combination of, well, I'm naturally responding to external stimuli. I'm naturally reacting to things. And so, because I mean, and this is a kind of, this is why I went into some of those metaphysical rants at the beginning, is because in some sense, um, that if you are using all your cognitive functions in a non-pathological sense, that you have a kind of transcendental, uh, unassailable uh, integrity of agency and free will. Uh, and so, you own all of your actions, as it were, or you own all of your cognitions, rather, to be more precise. Uh, and you are an equal, but separably in that equality, you are a potentially, you regard yourself as having the potential to uh, be a, I was going to say supervailing, um, controller. Uh, so in some sense, your participation will never, it's like Gene Roddenberry's, sort of original intention in Star Trek, that the characters do not have, uh, I mean, I can't even remember that phrase now. They don't have inner conflicts. They are evolved, in inverted commas. Anyway, okay, so those are sort of vague comments, but so I was talking about how the superego is almost like the reservoir of experience, and in some sense, it's an ulterior explanation for the source of experience, which can be negated or displaced or supplanted by the positive development of an internal locus of control, which would essentially be taking responsibility away from the superego. But essentially, how the superego interacts with the positive structure is through it's not directly, it's indirectly. And so there has to be a middle ground of interaction. And that middle ground of interaction, in some sense, is a one-way flow. Or it's a one-way uh, experience. So, in a cognitive sense, all of the framing of your experience or the style of your experience, the source of it, is the superego. So the superego is where your experiences are coming from. Until you learn to take responsibility for or sort of investigate that experience and break it down into conscious decision making and structures that will supplant being subjected to that experience. But what that experience is, I take it to be the emotional tones. That is the metagram. The emotional tones in metagram and the emotional tone circuitry of each personality style is the superego's language in how it mediates reality, or it is the lens or the filter through which reality is witnessed by the positive structure. And so if you're very young and you only have taken some responsibility for your subconscious, you still need to be able to, in some sense, have an integrated unconscious and an ego, but it's very lax. It doesn't have a very strict internal, sort of conscious developments that can sort of impinge on one another, or that can start to kind of rub up against and aggravate one another. It's very uncomplicated because the structures aren't going to get into each other's way. The structures of tentative responsibility aren't going to sort of be clogging the works. And so you have a raw experience to a large extent of receiving an emotional. You see, these emotional tones are not your emotional state. They are themselves cognitive inflections, and so in some sense, you can see it as coloring the you can see it as almost like your tone of mind, your tone of grammar, of cognitive grammar, is going to be in that language, is going to be in that um, field of expression. So that sort of that TI thing that I was talking about, you're going to have objects, mental objects, which are going to have specific uh, signatures that belong to those emotional tones. So they're going to be made. They're going to be made out of those emotional tones. The objects are going to be crafted from those emotional tones. And then essentially, the better you get at discerning the contents of those objects and supplanting the emotional tone with a positive structure, the more you can kind of mature and escape from having these objects thrust upon you, from having these objects, um, essentially, you will be able to make them consciously rather than be uh, you know essentially that mystery of composition is what makes it an external locus of control versus an understanding of its composition, which makes it an internal locus of control. Um, Now, it is. There are layers. It's more complicated than this. This is just a kind of yeah. You should. So obviously, I'll have to sort of start refining how I explain this in the future. But what is more complicated than this is that the superego has a particular signature of of the emotional tone circuitry, and what that signature relates to is that in some sense there are three sections within the superego. It has and it functions as it has the same type of anatomy as any of the sides of the mind do. Um, it has a death, it has a lust, it has a vanity, it has an enticed lust, it has a trial, and it has a sin. And its trial and its sin is what is donated to the subconscious to be the seed of the subconscious as it's repurposed and transformed into the death and the lust of the subconscious. So that is how the negative starts developing the positive, is that it starts off with the donation of its trial and its sin, which it doesn't like. But before that, just talking about the emotional tone that is being that is the medium of communication between the entirety of the superego and the entirety of the positive structures, that you have to imagine that I called it a negative, as in, like, to use the metaphor of a negative that gets developed into a picture. Um, that negative, I mean, I guess it is slightly ambiguous, but actually, it's a bit of a good metaphor, actually. That you have to imagine that negatives are taken from an impression. You know, it's the impression of light in a room that then gets recorded as a negative. It reacts. The light reacts chemically, and it leaves you with a negative, um, because the chemicals are photosensitive. But there is okay. Well, it is a good metaphor, but I'm probably going to strain it too much. But essentially, if you can say that within the metaphor, the light itself is a subjective impression of the meaning that you garner from perhaps some set of incidents or trauma or something that was impressionable to you. Well, what was impressionable to you was not reality, it was the light that your mind shone on it. It was the it was how much vision you gave it in your contemplation. Uh, it was how you set your mind to receive the impression as well, in some sense. Um, and that is a bit of an artful production. It wasn't so much that it just happened and you received the snapshot in your mind. it's that you essentially resolved this. So in some sense, you had to kind of concoct the chemicals that precipitated the negative. Um, Perhaps you didn't know what you were doing. You were just toying with it to some degree. Anyway, the thing is that like that negative, in some sense, is a sequence of emotional tones. Like I have a separate account of it in metatype. In metatype, I can show the actual the architecture of it, the bones of it. But just knowing the skeletal structure of something is not the same thing as knowing the movement of it. And this is why people that share the same metatype, they have different metagram types, because the skeletal structure might tell you what species it is, but the different members in the species, uh, have unique traits, perhaps, or they have slightly different strategies that work depending uh, on a kind of individual propensity for. Anyway, that's a bit of a weak metaphor, but anyway, the thing is that there are broader species of emotional tone circuitry, essentially, that they don't all look exactly the same. And basically, the difference between the emotional tone circuitries are what the Hindus call sattva, rajas, and tamas. And what that difference actually is that, and this might change, but if it changes, it won't change around that much. But I believe that sattva, the the trial and the death of the superego, um, oh, okay, well, let me rather be precise. I mean, I think it is this, but I might be one off as well. But I believe that the trial of the superego is the first emotional tone in the circuit. Uh, and in Rajas, I believe that it's the vanity in the superego that is the first emotional tone in the circuit. And there are always six, because there are six items in the and so there's a particular sequence, um, which, yeah, it doesn't go in order. It kind of jumps around, which is a bit strange. But and tamas, it is the death of the superego. Um, is the first emotional tone, and as far as I can tell, the first emotional tone, and obviously this is not the same as the positive structure. This is talking about the negative um, medium that is developing the positive structure. I think that the first link in the chain is is somewhat more significant, because all the other links in the chain flow from the first link, and so the actual ground zero, as it were, because essentially, and I do think that it's because it's like the false prophet. But what is a false prophet in this sense? The false prophet in this sense is a fictitious entity that you've imagined in your mind. You've created a voice in your head, and you've said, "Oh, let's pretend that I'm talking to myself in the future," or something like that. You have to create a fictitious voice from yourself. You have to give. I mean, where does it get I mean, you're not talking to an alien voice. You're talking to yourself. um you're talking to a version of yourself, an aspect of yourself that only has your resources to tap into. And so, I mean, you have to construct it out of something. But eventually if you're going to make a constructed entity, you have to start somewhere and then build around that. You can't just import it all at once. You have to understand the structure that you're making or whatever. And so, what is actually uh, now, it might be true that people don't have such a fixed metagram type. It might be that they have a vague impression and that the emotional tones themselves quickly fall into a pattern that leads them into condensing or congealing into one of the metagram types. So there might be pivotal points of development where, like, for example, when you start taking responsibility for the positive structures in your unconscious, then maybe you've kind of already negated other metagram types, but there really aren't that many metagram types for each metatype. I think the most that one type, I think I mean, some types only have two metagram types. Some metatypes only have two metagram types, and I think the one that has the most is probably five. Um, so that would give you the most leeway. But I do think, in some sense, that you might even already be subtyped in terms of right from the start. You might be not be able to make many choices other than staying to your guna, because essentially the starting point might be able to be remodulated to some degree. It might be able to sort of be because it might not be a perfectly defined starting point, but the geography of where you place the first object might be fixed. You might not be able to kind of migrate that to a different location. You might already be set to Rajas, Tamas, or Sattva. Um, but I do think that the relationship to the superego, in some sense, probably matches the description of the God of the world in the scriptures. Uh, that the superego, in some sense, is the God of the world, um, which is another name that the scriptures give to the spirit of man, to Satan, um, because that is effectively how it literally operates psychologically. Uh, it has authority over your experience. Uh, okay, moving along. So, okay, so I added some speculation to that, but I think generally it's probably quite fixed to that. And so, in some sense, because Sattva has their first block in the trial, they are more they are seen as the best type of false ego to have, Sattva. And the reason why I can imagine this is because essentially they're they have the most direct access to the root of their negative, because the root of their negative is exists within their positive structure. Because I didn't explain this before, but oh no, I did actually. That the trial and the sin of the superego is repurposed as the death and the lust of the subconscious. So sattva can actually, without crossing over and channeling the superego, which is a very it's quite a sort of a dark thing to do that. Uh, I have some commentary on that as well. I think a lot of people might let their sexuality be controlled by their superego, and I think that this has actually been a cultural development that didn't used to exist. Um, perhaps other epochs, or I think that there is something to the, generally speaking, the Christian culture, um, which no longer, I can imagine that this sort of thing was, this impulse towards some form of idolatry was somewhat satiated through animal sacrifice. That killing animals and sacrificing them to God in payment for sin um, was in some way a way to assuage, to get the God of the world off your back, um, for the positive development that you have sort of been excavating, um, and fighting against it. Because in some sense, I do think that even if you have a positive response, if you start developing an internal locus of control, if you don't perfect it, if you don't complete it, if you don't go all the way, whatever you haven't fully taken full responsibility for, whatever remains, is going to have this kind of uh, is perhaps going to be supercharged by the superego, um, to reaffirm, uh, I mean, in some sense, it's probably not actually because of the superego trying to take revenge. It's more so that you haven't quite struck a you haven't been growing your internal locus of control, um, in an exactly even keeled way or something like that. Okay, this is slightly speculative, I guess. I guess I should talk about the three species of idolatry. So I think that there is, what I think is happening in terms of people's sexuality to a large extent as an expression of the superego, which in some sense I think is a way to, what is happening is you are objectifying your positive structure, and you're looking at your positive structure from the perspective of your superego. And so you're kind of, you are actually looking at yourself from a disembodied perspective. And I call that sort of mind idolatry. That you are making your mind this, you are giving your contemplative paradigm over to the superego directly. You're saying, hey, take control of this. Take a turn at playing me like a video game. So I'm going to sort of take on the superego valence and surrender my mental capacities to and powers to see what the superego will do with this. And I mean that doesn't have to be done with sexuality, but I do think that uh, I mean that could be done in other respects in some sense. I think that could also be done in certain forms of sort of I mean, you have to forgive me for using stereotypes, but sort of like um, weird kinds of pagan magic ritual and things like that, that you solemnly believe that you are. Uh, I think it could be tapped into from those sorts of things. I mean, I guess also, uh, I think in the charismatic churches, they are largely, I think, channeling their superego as well. I mean, I think what is generally happening with what I call mind idolatry, and I understand that that's a very sort of weird esoteric way of framing that, is that there's an involution of the positive structure. It is somewhat, it's gaining a quality of magical thinking to a large extent because it's sort of, it wants to experience the primal emotional tone source of their experience. And so they are contracting responsibility for the more sophisticated, because I mean, I didn't talk about this yet, but essentially the subconscious is almost like your base inclination. Your unconscious is almost like your conscience. It's like contemplating about the kind of the indirect consequences sort of on retrospect. It's kind of like retrospectively thinking about your own internal values and inclinations, which are like this. So your subconscious is very visceral, and then your unconscious is quite contemplative in some sense, and then your ego is like your social mask. It's like the role you have to perform the ego, and you're trying to incorporate your conscience in how you think your environment works. So it's kind of like you and the world. The ego is like the complete integration. And in some sense, the ego feels the temptation from the superego to surrender to the superego the most. And the ego is already at a disadvantage because I don't think that it can, it doesn't actually have all of its own resources. It has to try to aspirationally develop itself um, using cognitive functions that it finds in the earlier positive structures from the unconscious and the subconscious. So it has to kind of fashion these together towards the aspirational. Um, but it doesn't have an aspiration. Those aspirational functions, it wants to perform them, but it can't perform them directly because it has to sort of carry this dead weight with it, or it can't jettison um, what's already part of its functioning. A good way of picturing this is that it's like Russian dolls, that you have a wooden Russian doll, and then it grows a shell around it, which becomes a bigger Russian doll that encapsulates it. And then there's another Russian doll that grows around that, and that's what the ego is the third shell. But those shells have to be developed. And when you are on the lower level, you're always naively, directly sort of being confronted with the next thing, and then sort of as you collect enough of that, then you'll move on. But I do think that Sattva is at a huge advantage and making advancement because, in some sense, their positive structure gets a leg up right from the start. Whereas other people are kind of like, I think Sattva feels a very keen distinction against the superego. They already sort of they already have a natural inclination or disposition to be opposed to the superego and to develop in spite of it, and that it is just a kind of and that just so happens because the strongest component of their emotional tone circuitry they have recourse uh, to, they have access to from their positive structure, whereas everyone else, it's hidden in their relative to their positive structure. It's hidden within the superego. It's hidden in a realm of the superego that is not part of their positive structure. So for them to actually know what's going on, they have to kind of channel the dark side, as it were. They have to channel the negative in some sense. So they are more tempted into, let's say, forms of involution. They are more tempted to not fighting the superego or supplanting it, and trying to gain an internal locus of control. So they are dispositionally, I would say, slightly disadvantaged in terms of gearing themselves towards an internal locus of control. Okay. Okay. Now, this is going to be a repeat if you've been following my other recordings on this, which have some very good things in them, but are also very speculative and embarrassing. But now I've got a model that works very, very nicely. But so I said that each side of the mind has got 6 parts. Now there is this internal positive tension between the positive sides of the mind. There is a lot of sort of collateral impingement against one another, and especially in the ego, because the ego is fundamentally trying to homogenize the positive sides of the mind. But I do think that many people, okay, or yeah, so many people can also not be developed on the level of the ego, and they can exist perhaps in the unconscious. They've only sort of reached the unconscious, which is very sort of reactive, because they're not even acting in the world, as it were. They don't see themselves acting in the world. They're just sort of, they have a conscience, but they can only access that in retrospect. Okay, so that's one level of development. But I would say the general formula for accessing maturity is what I've now refined this concept now that I've got this perfected model, because I used to talk about this, and I think I was really onto something, and I was roughly correct, but now this is going to be a refinement of that concept, is what I call perfecting the vanity. And so the 6 parts of each side of the mind is the death, the lust, the vanity, the enticed lust, the trial, and the sin. Now, the lust is the child function in MBTI, essentially. Obviously, my system is going to be different, but I think that lines up very nicely. The vanity is the hero function, the enticed lust is the parent function, and the trial is the inferior function. Now, there are themes that are worth pointing out, because there's an internal drama here. Because essentially the inferior function, if you get pressed in terms of the inferior function too hard, you essentially regress down to a more stable, positive side of the mind. So if you give up responsibility for tackling your own inferior function, or if you get too anxious about absorb or tolerating your inferior function, you kind of move down to a more basic isotope, and then you essentially lean into experiencing the superego as a, so you kind of you lean into a kind of almost projection onto your environment. So essentially things in your environment take on a kind of emotional energy, or in terms of how it impresses upon your experience. And you might even realize that those sorts of impressions that you get, they're they're persistent, or like, I mean, you might not have them all the time, but like they're the same ilk. They always are of the same sort of set. It's always this. It's just variations on the same kind of experience. Which might give you a clue that that could be something that you could be taking responsibility for. That you could be consciously managing that experience and sort of supplanting it consciously. Okay, so what I was saying about the inferior function. So the inferior function. So if the inferior function sort of gets pressed too hard, what actually creates the involution in some sense is that the parent function that was connected to that inferior function gets abandoned. It's the abandonment of the parent function post, as it were, or because it's kind of like the school teacher. So when the school teacher sort of runs away, then the class is de facto dismissed. So a new parent function comes in to take its place, which is capable of I have to think about this. Yeah, I mean, this is not like entirely true. This is like partially true because this is just like a sort of a theme. In some, it's much easier to see this if it was drawn out. But essentially, the let me find my notes. Okay, so because you see, I guess I need to emphasize this, that inferior functions are also another. Inferior functions is the trial, and the trial of the subconscious is the death of the unconscious, and the trial of the unconscious is the death of the ego. So the difference between an inferior function being a death or an inferior function being a trial is if the parent function is kind of ascendant, is ascending to lord over the requisite uh, is converting the prior positive side of the mind's trial function into a death. So essentially, the parent function is the kind of is so essentially, if the parent function is treating what would otherwise be a trial function as a death, then you are in a higher positive side of the mind. So, if you have an aspirational parent function, which is what I call the parent function in the ego side of the mind, treating, um, in some sense, both the subconscious's trial, but also the unconscious's uh, the subconscious's trial and the unconscious's trial, uh, as a death. Then the aspirational inferior function of the ego will stick out. So if these things start flaring up as if the parent function essentially loses composure over treating what are the trial, because they can't be, if they, so yeah, if the, so the parent function's relationship to influences that are are in the stack of inferior functions, if it's not able to be selective, if it's not able to sort and manage those things, then it kind of, the whole isotope of that side of the mind sort of collapses into a lower state. And so, like, which side of the mind you're in terms of the positive structure, and perhaps if you fail on all three of the inferior function, then perhaps that also just means that you become the superego. I think that's actually a good way of describing essentially how you would directly channel the superego. Um, okay. Yeah. So there's this sort of this internal positive stuff. Okay, I didn't go through this that nicely, but and there are other important things here, which is essentially that it's important to notice that then, because there's this overlap between the sides of the mind, although there is almost a special exception in terms of the ego is kind of like the odd one out, because the ego has these things that I'm calling aspirational functions, which aren't even inside the false ego complex. They're kind of outside of it. Um, and so I think, yeah, I mean, I'm still at a loss to work out exactly what would be the way to dismantling the false ego complex. I still would have to think about that independently. And I can only speculate on it now, but it might be worth experimenting, because in some sense I think that with this kind of consciousness, it might be possible to more, in a more conscious and concerted way, to do radical things like purely channel the ego and keep it clean from devolution. Uh, and to see if it's possible to sort of perfect the ego in the sense of trying to find a way that to overcome the superego by brute force, perhaps by sort of taking full responsibility for it, but also when you're failing to do that, you can also perhaps track how it's influencing you. And so perhaps if you perfectly inhabited your ego, that you might kind of get to a point where you sort of are at a break-even point of breaking the back of the negative in some sense, that because you have a certain mastery over it. And so because your mastery over it is so complete, then you can actually forget about it without the problem of it looming and reasserting itself, or being a kind of being haunted by it. That the perfection of the ego might be a sort of a way to segue into um, not having to fit into the role of your ego, but by the practice of perfecting your ego and being able to fully supplant, like totally supplant the superego, that you have learned the skills that you wouldn't fall into the same sort of problem of having an external locus of control and redeveloping a new superego. Anyway, that's stuff to be thought about, but that essentially, I mean, in some sense, it doesn't even matter if you perfectly perform the ego or not. It's so much as that you learn the lesson necessary to extricate yourself from the influence of the superego. So, in some sense, it doesn't really matter how good you are at performing the role of the ego. You just have to kind of learn that lesson. And so, as long as the lesson is perfected, it doesn't really matter how good you are at, as long as you kind of are consciously experiencing, toying with that to some degree, so that you learn all the internal crevices and all the internal impingements and dynamics that precipitates the mastery and the kind of the consciousness over it. That you develop a kind of transcendental conscientiousness. in terms of in terms of the sort of internal tracking these sort of internal circuitries and things. Being able to name the sources and track and to trace the flow of your cognition, or basically you would be able to develop a perfect kind of mental control. Okay, let me talk more about other forms of immaturity. So I think a good way to develop maturity is between the hero function and the inferior function. Is that if you steel man your inferior function, if you are not, if you if you stop trying to avoid your inferior function, but you instead get your hero function to tolerate it. The hero function is the vanity, by the way. Um, in my system, I call it the vanity. So if you essentially steelman means that you get the most stringent argument from the inferior function. You don't try to avoid it. You try to weaponize it, and then you let it damage your hero function, so that your hero function can work out how to be resilient against the inferior function. You basically, the parent, you don't use the parent function as a buffer for your to to fix the match between your hero and your inferior. You don't use the parent function. You instead you use the parent function to sort of you almost try to gain a consciousness of the parent function to step out of the way so that the inferior function and the hero function can come to a grown up, mature resolution. And I call this perfecting the vanity. And the point of this is it actually makes sin conscious. Because the reason why people don't even know that they sin and because they can't tolerate the trial. And the only way that you can learn about the sin is by exploring your vanity. And people have undeveloped vanities because they just avoid the uncomfortableness of their inferior function. So, I mean, yeah, this I think is the because you see when you can get this kind of homogenization that I'm describing between the inferior function and the hero function, then you will be consciously sinning. You won't be doing it on the next, well, in some sense, whenever you are have a trial and a sin, that leads to the next side of the mind, unless you're in the ego, because then there's no other place to go. So you need to, obviously, the subconscious side of the mind, when it has a trial and it has a sin, you very carefully, or what usually happens ordinarily is that you very quickly translate and convert that trial and sin into the death and the lust of the next side of the mind. And so you don't even experience that sin anymore because you instead just experience it as a death and a lust. The ego doesn't have that luxury, which is why people's egos are so poorly developed, and why generally they're so immature. And so when you start perfecting the vanity, you will at the same time, you're going to be stoking your inferior function, which is going to send you back into the earlier sides of the mind where you didn't reconcile with your sin then either. But essentially, when each side of the mind is sort of has a way of predicting thematically from the vanity what will be the inherent style of essentially the sinful outcome, then essentially you will be able to source the sin in the vanity, which means you'll be conscious of the vanity. You'll be conscious of the sin through the vanity, and that is what I call a perfected vanity. And then you will start to have a very solid internal locus of control, and you won't be experiencing things from the superego. I think this is what is described in the scriptures when it says that first you must descend before you ascend, in terms of understanding the superego before you understand the positive structures. But anyway, my view of the Christian doctrine is very psychological, and I think that the doctrine has been very badly misinterpreted in many ways. Okay, is that everything that I wanted to talk about? Yeah, so it is interesting that the metagram emotional tones, in some sense, is a separate account of these structures. So it's almost like an alternative view to metatype, which has the actual dimensions that this is happening within. And then there are, I think I'm going to make a third recording to talk about it. I'm going to talk about my observations in interacting with people who I believe are the exact same metagram type as me, which obviously means we also have the same metatype, because metagram is just a subtype within metatype essentially. But as to the role of substance, because just because people have the same metagram circuitry, that doesn't mean that they have actually constructed the same objects, the same developmental structure. It doesn't mean that they have done that. Uh, and the kind of the anyway, it has given me at least some small insight, and I'll probably add some more general comments as well. Okay. I didn't say it, but I mean, the emotional tone circuitry, obviously the point is that the first one is the most significant because it is the kind of the ground zero in the superego. That obviously the inference there is that that is the anchor of the whole program. That is the anchor of the whole. You know, that everything else is sort of a modulation or a kind of a procedure that has obviously proceeded from um, that anchor. So it's all anchored in that. Every subsequent emotional tone is a novation from that line that connects to that original impression. So in some sense, it is the formula that describes the fractal of the negative, to use a mathematical um, metaphor, and it keeps on looping around. So the emotional tone circuitry goes through all 6 objects, and then it starts again. Um, which I'm sure actually it must get bored. Perhaps it gets so bored if you somehow perfect the ego that it just kind of self-terminates, that you just kind of exhaust it because it has no expression in consciousness anymore, because your positive structure just completely sort of displaces it. Oh yeah, so I mean, I've come up with many tentative theories, but now that I've actually got a model, I can start to imagine maybe what some procedures might end up accomplishing.